All share Donald Trump should not have fired Steve Bannon. Shouldn't have done it. It's a bad thing. We'll talk about it when Freedom returns at 5.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. You gave me an idea.
Yeah,
because we were talking in the break.
Yeah, all these statues that are coming down reminds me of when they took down the Joe Paterno statue at Penn State. You know, it's because they put this block, this 2x4, and this, they put a shield up. Then they take it down. It's kind of sad.
So why don't we rehabilitate Joe Pa and replace all the Robert E. Lee statues with Joe Pa statues? Maybe we could get support for that. So that's one of our stories. Another is, of course, the eclipse and mainly the impact on animals. Get an email.
Well, because they said don't let your pets out between noon today and 1:45.
Yeah, in response to your discussion, this is from a listener, in response to your discussion of animals and the eclipse, I've been losing sleep to worry about my 3 horses. Then it came to me, put a bra on their face. So the cups are over each eye. The bra secures nicely behind the jaw. Wish I could send a photo. I wish you could too. Great little weird science impersonation you got going on in the stables there. Thank you for that.
Read the other text message about blindness. No, maybe, yeah. Well, no.
Yeah. Okay, so now we go from the ridiculous to the sublime. Pardon my Tom Paine. And we're joined by our friend Scott Adams. He, of course, the Dilbert cartoon creator, somebody who knows something about communicating effectively to the everyman, those like me living lives of quiet desperation. And also a licensed hypnotist. He, again, reminder for those who have forgotten, Scott Adams, I think, may have been the first human being to predict Donald Trump would win the election, like way back when he rode down the escalator because of his particular style of communication. Scott Adams saw something and he turned out to be right. And it's always interesting to get his take on Trump's communication, the choices he's making, what he's actually doing from Scott's perspective versus what the layman like me hears. And so we're pleased to have Dilbert creator Scott Adams back on the show. Scott, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you.
So, why don't we start with this before we get to the specific of Trump? Why don't we get to the general? You had an interesting piece on your blog about mass hysteria and how to know you're in a mass hysteria bubble. And my question is, in this day and age, are we ever not in a mass hysteria bubble?
No, there are lots of bubbles all the time. So there will always be pockets of civilization who are in a bubble pretty much all the time. Some of them matter, some of them don't. But in the case of politics, I think what happens is, at least my observation, is that the party that loses gets triggered into an illusion to explain why the heck they were so sure they were going to win, and then they lost. I think that when Obama was president, the right was a little crazy, with their birtherism stuff and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And when Trump got elected, it triggered the other side. So the side that's out of power gets a little crazy, and I think that's what we're seeing now.
Well, what do you think is the most visible mass hysteria of the moment?
Well, the biggest mass hysteria is the idea that the country somehow elected a KKK sympathizer for president, and despite the fact that he keeps saying he's not, and has fairly consistently said that, people are pretty sure that they hear a silent signal, a racist dog whistle, I guess, that only racists and the people who are talking about it can hear. And what they do is they look at evidence such as, and you'll see this a lot, people say, well, it's clear we elected a racist, look at, and they'll throw out one piece of evidence. I'll just pick one randomly. They'll say, what about that birther stuff, birtherism, that was all racist, and then I'll point out, he did the same thing to Ted Cruz. And if he were running,
right.
if we were running against McCain, he would have done the same thing about McCain because he was born in Panama. So it's just a typical political thing you do. So if you don't have the racism goggles on, you see a person doing anything he can do to win, consistent with his philosophy that he will do anything it takes to win. But if you think it is racism, it's just one more brick in this big wall that you've created in your mind. Now, this is not to say that I know the president's inner thoughts, so I'm not reading his mind as so many of his critics are. I'm just looking at the facts, and certainly somebody questioning whether someone is capable to run for president based on their birth just looks like standard political, tricks. It doesn't look like racism to me.
Well, and also, I mean, it's not like Trump hadn't been in the public eye for the last 30 years and under significant scrutiny, including a lot of tabloid scrutiny for his, wives and so forth. So that, the in a high-profile business, the possibility that such inclinations would come out if they were actually present, much less omnipresent. Also, again, as has been pointed out, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is Jewish and a senior advisor, been kind of his right hand. His daughter converted to Judaism. So, boy, it's hard to square the circle in that charge. And so I wonder if my friend John Cass over at the Chicago Tribune has it right when he says he's not a racist, but he's a flatterer, a tribal thinker, narcissistic enough to love those who love them without standard. Is that more the character flaw Trump suffers from?
Well, I try to stay out of his head, because anytime you say, in his inner thoughts, he's secretly thinking this, that's the crazy part.
Yeah.
So I'd rather look at what he says and what he does. I take the Dr. Laura position that you are what you do.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not doing something bad, you're not a bad person, even if you happen to have some bad thoughts, which we all suffer from now and then.
Well, so what he did last week in terms of his spoken word in response to Charlottesville, how did you interpret that?
Well, the way I interpret it is that I don't think anybody who voted for President Trump was thinking to themselves, thank God I have a moral leader to help me with the tough decisions. I don't think there was anybody who was thinking, I'm a little bit confused about morality. My God and my parents and my friends have left a gap. I need some help on the moral questions. Literally no one was looking for that, and he never promised it. There was no point during the campaign he said, let me bring a moral dimension to the presidency. He talked about jobs and ISIS and that stuff. Now, on the jobs and ISIS and stuff, he's doing pretty well. And on the moral dimension, which he never promised us, he promised us law and order, equal justice under the law, that sort of thing. And when it came to talking about the tragedy in Charlottesville, he was completely tone deaf. He gave us a basic law and order speech that said, hey, anybody who did stuff wrong, I'm against anybody who did anything wrong. Basically, it was just a generic, flat, completely tone deaf in terms of how it would be received. But he did not take the opportunity to offer moral leadership in an area where, frankly, people would have questioned him anyway. So I think it was a huge political mistake. It was a gigantic communication mistake. And by the way, the people who criticize me for saying I say everything he does is brilliant, here's a case where it clearly wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But what the opposition made of it was they took somebody who just didn't want to enter that dimension because it wasn't what he promised, and it's certainly not what he's best qualified to do, the moral pronouncements. But there was a place for it, for the healing of the country, etc. And I describe this more as what the country wanted was a cry point. They wanted somebody to cry with them, because it really was just a hideous event. If you watched any of the video of the guys with the tiki tortures, it's just truly one of the most frightening things I've ever seen. And people needed to share that fear, that loathing, and he wasn't on board with that at the moment. And he never really was on board with the emotion of it, but he did eventually name the names of the bad guys.
Yeah, but the problem is, right, even if that's not what he promised, that's part of the job that's forced upon you. We have a governor here in Illinois that came into office saying, I have no social agenda. Well, okay, that's nice that you don't, but guess what? The General Assembly, members of the General Assembly, the Democrats do, and they're going to force it upon you, and you're going to have to respond in that moment. And it's the same thing with President Trump. What you're most adept at, or what you do or don't want to do, sometimes you're captive to events, and you, as the president, are looked to for leadership. And in that moment, he shrank from the challenge.
Yeah, it's a funny kind of thing because there's a little bit of magical thinking involved, which is the thought that what the president said or how he connects with us in some moral dimension will somehow change anything. And what you saw was, and I've been saying this for a while, social media has largely replaced what used to be the republic because politicians no longer can go against the majority. It's just impossible. Social media will eat them to death. And so morality really has been moved from our leaders to the people. And the people were completely clear on this. You know, outside that small sliver of pure racists who are on the side of the KKK, both the Republicans at large and Democrats at large said, on this, we're all on the same side. But, of course, the Democrats couldn't really hear the Republicans say it because, you know, there's some bad elements in that larger group. So in a weird way, it was one of the most unifying things that we've seen in a long time. You know, short of actual war, which is a unifying for a bad reason, this was terribly unifying, but people haven't quite grasped that yet because we're still processing the horror of it. But the unifying thing was, if you look around, you have a really hard time finding anybody who is on the side of the tiki torch guys. I mean, that's, you know, I haven't seen one. I mean, as long as I've been talking about this, I haven't actually met anyone who would take the other side. So there is a unifying element of this, but it gets lost in the fact that the president didn't quite communicate in a way that the people expected. Now, whether or not he should have, well, yeah, he should have in terms of politics and in terms of what we wanted, but did it really make any difference? It didn't really make any difference because the public was never unclear about what was the right side of the story. There was no ambiguity here whatsoever.
He is Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert cartoon series. Scott, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one